Well, Joan Ryan, thank you so much for joining me today on The Highest Level. And I'm very excited to talk to you because, we share a very common interest that we're both passionate about related to our books on intangibles. And I wanted to start today by just kind of hearing if you could take us through the journey of kind of where the idea for your book came from.
Well, first of all, Evan, thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. It's a small fraternity of people who have books called Intangibles. So about that. So thanks for having me on. The book, team chemistry has always been something I was a little bit fascinated by, and I wasn't really thinking about it as team chemistry, but being in clubhouses and locker rooms for so many years, there were just certain teams that had this something, right? Like you just liked being around those guys. And I say guys because it's almost always guys that I was covering, professional sports. So then in 2009, I had left the newspaper business in 2007. And I had a book contract to write this book about my son. And I went to the various sports teams in the Bay Area to kind of pitch my wares to them and say, I'm writing a book. However, I really want to have, more going on. And basically it was just to, as when you write a book, you get paid, if you get an advance, you get paid when you sign the contract, and then you really don't see any more money until you deliver the manuscript. And then finally, when the book's published, you get your third. But so I wanted to make some money in between those times. And as it happened, the book took me 10 years to write and publish. So I was really glad I had this work with, as it turned out to be, the San Francisco Giants. So in 2008, the Giants hired me to be their media consultant. And 2008 was the first year that Barry Bonds wasn't with the team since 2000, whatever. And so I go in 2009 to a reunion of the 1989 Giants national championship,
Pennant.
Why am I?
They won the pennant, correct?
They won the pennant. Yeah.
Yes.
National League Championship, the NCAA.
National League champs. Yes.
Haven't had quite enough coffee yet. So anyway, I go to this and I loved that team. That was my favorite team of all time, obviously still is. And so I couldn't wait to see all these guys again, because what I had seen in their clubhouse, in the late 80s, it's Will Clark and Robbie Thompson and Mike Krukow, and just this, junk drawer jumble of a team, right? And so when I was in that clubhouse, you could just feel it. There was something about that team. They weren't a great team, yet they won the pennant, and they got obliterated by the Oakland A's in the World Series. And of course there was the big earthquake, and, it was quite the time. So I go back and I'm in the tent in the parking lot of our new downtown ballpark, and all the guys are there, and almost every one of them showed up, from like Horsehead, New York, and, down in Arizona, from everywhere. And you could still see it in their eyes and hear it in their voices. They still loved each other. And I just walked around. I said, God, there is something to this. And this was just a few years after Moneyball came out, which I loved. However, Moneyball was all about analytics and changed front offices in every sport there it was in America and beyond, that it was all about stats and it was all about algorithms. And I totally bought into that, and I still do. However, there was something else too. It wasn't, Michael Lewis, to my face, totally dismissed that team chemistry completely. It didn't exist. And I'm like, have you done your research there, Michael Lewis, on this? But anyway, I thought there is something here. And so on that evening in 2009, driving home, I just thought, God, well, what is this thing that we call team chemistry? And what makes it up? Does it exist? And then how does it affect performance? Because why should we even talk about team chemistry, right? Unless it affects performance. So it was about connecting those dots, and that launched into what became like 165 interviews and tons of research and reading books. And finally the book came out right into the teeth of COVID in 2020.
Yes. And, obviously an interesting time to be publishing a book, but really interesting how the idea kind of started and evolved over time. And I kind of like a couple of things that you said, and I think it relates to my own experiences and why I wanted to write a book. I know very early on in my coaching career, we would sit in rooms, we would be discussing recruiting and player evaluation, and we would only be talking about their measurables, their stats, their size, their talent on the field. And I always felt, even from a young age, that like there was something more. We're not talking about a young man's work ethic. We're not talking about the family environment they were being raised in. We're not talking about all of these things that if you've been on one of those teams or you've been around one of those teams or those people, you recognize that there's something different about them. There's a reason why those people and those groups of individuals have success. And I felt that from very early on, probably very similar to your process. I didn't feel I was qualified enough at 22 years old, sitting in those rooms for the first time, to actually speak up and say anything. But I think like as I progressed through my coaching career, I started to see evidence of this more and more. And so maybe just kind of talk, because you were obviously working with the Giants during a really interesting time where, I mean, one of the most successful runs in terms of baseball that we've seen really in the last 30, 40 years. So just kind of talk about like how the idea for team chemistry was evolving during this magnificent run that the Giants were on really over the last 12 years or so.
Yeah, they won 3 World Series, over the course of 5 years. And it was this, again, sort of a jumble of a team, but they had a lot of really great young players. And, they come in, and I'm sure you've seen this in, the NFL and college locker rooms, that, a guy coming in for the first time, he's finally in a big, like in baseball, finally a big league, and they come in and their eyes are like saucers, but they're also walking around like they're on the prison yard. How do things work here? I don't know. And then somebody comes over, and, I would see these interactions. So like, you'd see Buster Posey, the biggest star on the team, or Hunter Pence, who was also a big star on the team, come over to that rookie and put his arm around him and say, "You're exactly the guy we need right now. So glad you're here. Come on, let's go. You're going to be great." And that rookie's whole body changes. His face relaxes. His voice is not a little squeak coming out anymore. And he feels like he's invited to belong. He's told he's ready. And when Buster Posey or Hunter Pence or somebody like that tells you that, you believe them. And like this kid named Matt Duffy, he went out and, he still had acne, on his face, and weighed 10 pounds. And he goes out there and he kills it right from the start. And when I asked him, months later, I said, Matt, God, we rarely see, he said, they said I was ready. And so I was ready. And then that's that power of belief. And that goes to, these two sides of performance, which is the analytics, because it does inform strategy and shifts and, all of those things that are so important because it pushes to the surface what's actually happening. Because we don't see that on a day-to-day basis, right? We don't remember every ball that was hit to right field, facing a lefty on Tuesdays, so it's like we see trends that you can't see otherwise, analytics. But what those guys, guys like Michael Lewis and others, what they don't get, and it's mind-boggling to me that they don't get this, is that it's actually human beings carrying out that brilliant strategy. They need to be motivated. They need to be committed. They need to bond. They need to trust each other, because otherwise you're just going off a sheet. And that's not how human beings work. That's not how sports work. That's not how businesses work. So the cutting edge teams are not the ones that were from Moneyball. That's old now. It's the ones that integrate, totally understand human nature and the analytics. They absolutely need both. And it seems to me just common sense that that's true.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I saw this too in my experiences. As I was saying, as a young 22-year-old, I was like, how are we not talking about this? Like, this doesn't seem right to me. But it just shows that there are kind of like, there's two sides of this aisle where there are people like, Michael Lewis, obviously somebody that I respect greatly, especially for his work that he's done in athletics. But it is very interesting because there's coaches in the same vein that everybody looks up to, that I look up to, but yet don't see it the same way. They see it as purely a talent-based thing. And I think what you're talking about, 20 years ago, analytics was a competitive advantage. Not everybody was utilizing it. But now there is so much analytics all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Like, bettors have the analytic information. Anybody that's doing fantasy football or fantasy sports has that access to that information. And I really wrote my book, and it seems like you're kind of mirroring the same message, which is character is the new competitive advantage. And the teams that don't fully integrate it, like you mentioned, really are definitely like not giving themselves every opportunity to achieve that highest level of performance. And I know in your book, you talk about like how team chemistry can't create talent. And I talk in my book about the talent paradox, which is talent is essential to success, but success is not determined by talent. In other words, there's all of these other things, these intangible characteristics that make up those great teams and those elite performers. Talk about where you saw that in kind of the evolution of the idea for this book. Obviously, you were around a lot of the great Giants teams. Were you seeing any teams that maybe were more talented than others, but yet couldn't quite reach that pinnacle of success, or maybe fail to reach their potential?
Right. Yeah. And that is, I mean, the greatest example, I mean, I wasn't part of it, obviously, but the greatest example was, and I don't have my information in front of me, I'm not a numbers person, was, I think it was the second or third dream team at the Olympics, American Dream Team. And they finished with the bronze medal. They were head and shoulders over every single team, but they did not connect. There was just this dysfunction on that team. And so talent didn't matter then. Talent does matter, but also we only think of talent as what they do on the field, right? We don't think of what they're doing in the clubhouse and in the locker room. And what happens in the clubhouse and the locker room informs performance on the field. So, for instance, I have a big chapter in my book on Johnny Gomes, a journeyman player, lifetime like 213 or 220 or something, batting average. And he bounced from team to team because he really wasn't a great player. But a pattern emerged during Johnny Gomes's career, and that was his teams won. So time after time after time, his teams won. And you're like, okay, is that a coincidence? Well, soon, of course, his teammates recognize that, okay, Johnny Gomes is the guy. He's having a huge impact on all of us. Well, what's that impact? How do you have an impact where he almost single-handedly spreads this contagion of trust, bonding, and 100% commitment. And it's not a commitment to a goal. It's the commitment to each other. And if you're committed to each other 100%, you play better. It's just how our brains work, right? So like, for instance, and I'm going to go back to Johnny Gomes, but Jake Peavy, Cy Young pitcher, played for the Giants for a few years after his Cy Young. And he is that guy who's on the mound that every team wants. You know, he's the snorter and the stomper, and he's, you know, just thrumming with passion and drive and grit. And he's on the mound. And I said, okay, so I'm talking to him, I'm interviewing him for the book. I said, I know you're a huge, huge proponent of team chemistry, you know, and how it helps everybody. I said, so I'm watching you on the mound and you're giving 100% already. And you can't give even 101%, you know, it just doesn't exist. I said, so why would team chemistry matter to you? Because you're already playing at your peak. And he had the line of the book, said, my teammates summon a fight in me I can't willingly summon for myself. And it blew me away. I said, that's it. And in all the research that I did and continue to do on the human brain and our physiology and how we respond, that's exactly what happens. You know, there's this power of relationship that summons more from us than what we are. And one neuroscientist explained it to me. He said, you know, human beings are open loop creatures. Okay, what do you mean by that? He said, we're born with open loops that only other people can complete. You cannot complete it for yourself. And, you know, the studies of babies, you know, the orphans who died, you know, in last turn of the century, Eastern Europe, they were trying to, you know, these babies were separated into their, you know, little cribs, and these are newborns. And to stop the spread of disease, the caretakers of all these newborns in these orphanages were told to not touch them or, you know, breathe on that, you know, anything more than you absolutely have to. So just changing them, feeding them, washing them. And they even put up plastic sheets between each of them. Well, what turned out was more babies died than ever before from disease. They died. Nobody knew why they were dying. And in one orphanage, every single baby died. And only 40 years later, when it was researched, like what happened here, you know, what continues to happen in these kinds of situations, that it was babies, like the rest of us, but babies especially, cannot survive without human connection. The touch, the cooing, you know, the cuddling, all of that is so that completes their open loop. And it continues for the rest of our lives. Our open loops are never completely closed, right? People are always out there. It's other people that make us whole and bring out our best.
Yes. Yeah. And I love what you said in terms of power of relationships. And I think that's a great line, especially when we're talking about, you know, raising the collective performance in due part to the power of those relationships. Like, let's talk about how you start building a culture of team chemistry. Like, what do you think is the starting point for any team or any leader hoping to build a team that can create this great chemistry?
Trust. Trust is at the foundation of every single relationship in our lives. There's not a single relationship you have in your life that isn't founded on trust. because it's the only way we can connect with each other. It's trust. And sometimes you're with teams or with groups of friends, whatever it is, you're waiting for somebody to prove that they're trustworthy, right? Well, I'm not going to trust them until I can see that that they've earned it or whatever. And what good teams do and good leaders do is that they initiate the trust. Like Buster Posey coming over to Matt Duffy as a rookie. I'm automatically trusting you. You may prove me wrong, but I am automatically trusting you. And what happens in our brains when we feel like we know we are trusted by that person, a chemical in our brain called oxytocin secretes, into our brain and into our bodies. And we have a physiological response that we feel trustworthy because somebody has trusted us. And we then, more times than not, almost always, trust back. Trust is contagious, but it needs to be initiated and reinforced. And trust comes in so many different packages. I mean, it can just be, I don't know, it can just be, hey, how's your kid doing? I heard that, he had to stay home because of COVID. Showing caring is showing trust. Because I look, somebody who really cares about me, I'm going to say, hey, I trust that person. I feel connected to that person. And so when you do that on a team in a business, on a team in sports, it spreads. And who doesn't want to be part of that team, part of that tribe? So outliers who were like, like a Barry Bonds. Well, Barry Bonds never did come over. He was that, guy on the island of misfit toys. And it was fine because he contributed so much on the field that nobody cared. But almost nobody can resist staying outside of a tribe because tribalism is our most deeply rooted human behavior. We're wired to be part of tribes. So trust is everything, and it's definitely the foundation and the start of a great culture.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that for me in my book, I was kind of thinking of it in terms of the people become your culture, and then also talking about the ripple effects of intangibles, which I think directly relates to what you just described. I mean, you much like your earlier example, like you may not be able to quantify the feeling that was in that tent with the 1989 pennant team 20 years later when none of the guys are playing and, long retired. And like, there's something there, and there's a ripple effect between, I really think that what you described with Buster Posey, a lot of people view that as well, that doesn't mean anything. Like, that has nothing to do with that person stepping up to the plate and hitting the ball in play, right? Like, they're here, they're in the majors, like this is their shot, like let's see if they can do it. But there is this incredible power that the team can have. And as you mentioned, kind of like the belief as well. I talk in my book about the 3 different buckets of intangibles, which are heart, mind, and team players. And those are kind of like the 3 intangibles that I broke down that you want to look for in the players. And you said something interesting, and I've heard you talk about this before. You talk about that not everybody has to like each other. Like, we can talk about the ripple effect of intangibles and like seeing somebody working hard or putting your arm around somebody and encouraging them. But you talk about that you don't have to necessarily like each other. So just kind of expand on that, because that's a little contrarian to what I think people would maybe picture as we're having this discussion.
Right. And I never even thought about that. Like, that could be a thing, because you do think about team chemistry, and we kind of, talk about camaraderie in the same way we talk about team chemistry. And came to understand that they're two separate things, right? You don't have to have camaraderie in order to have great team chemistry. And how did I, discover this? Was looking at, those old Oakland A's teams and, some of the Yankees teams that, literally would fight in the dugout and fight in the clubhouse and couldn't stand each other. But when they got out on the field, they could win. So, I would get this blowback of, well, those guys, how can you say team chemistry matters when those guys clearly didn't need it? So in, interviewing and researching and all that, it's like, well, they did have team chemistry. They had an unbelievable team chemistry, but it was what I call task chemistry. They had incredible chemistry on the field. And it's like people in business. You may not like the people, you don't want to go out to lunch with them, but you have great team chemistry because you work well together. And one of the reasons you work well together is that you're both driven, passionate. You share a need to do great work, right? You're honing your craft at all times because you love it. So you have that in common and nothing else, right? But that works. It elevates both your performances. And the greatest example is Barry Bonds with Jeff Kent. Two guys in baseball, they were both on the Giants for like 6 years together. And, both in the top 10 list of Bleacher Report's, 20 worst teammates in all of sports. And now you had two on the same team with the Giants. And you're thinking, oh my God, what were they thinking? This can't work. One's on one side, glaring at the other one at the other side of the clubhouse and literally had a fist fight on television in the dugout. But on the field, when I interviewed both of them for the book, each one said, there's no one I'd rather have on the field with me than the other one. Bonds said that about Kent. Kent said that about Bonds. And they were, because the two of them, would chew through a leather mitt to get a little advantage in winning. They both cared so much about winning and they had incredible respect for each other, but they couldn't stand each other up. So that was like, wow, there are different types of chemistry. And there's probably more than just, social emotional chemistry, which is what 99% of the human race has. And, the 1% that is just task chemistry.
Yeah. It's like when I first read that, my first thought was, well, I think you kind of have to be likable. But the more you kind of deconstruct it, and I'm listening to you, you talked earlier about trust. And yes, there's like the trust in terms of like our daily interactions, but there's also like the trust of us doing our job. Exactly. And it's like, not that you have to choose between the two, but if you could only have one, like on a team, especially teams that are performance driven, that operate in these highly competitive environments, like I don't have to like you. I don't have to be best friends with you. But like, I have to be able to trust you. I have to be able to know that like when it's the off season and we're all supposed to be putting in that extra time, that you're putting in that extra time. I have to know that in the critical moments of the game, when we're all doing our jobs, that you're going to do your job. So I think like in a way, you might be evolving my thought about, the likability piece. Because maybe it's different with leadership, but I think definitely when you're talking about being on a team and relying on others, nothing is more crucial than that trust, like you mentioned.
Right. And, trust is the foundation, and you can't, and, my three buckets, maybe, as just to take your analogy, is trust leads to bonding, leads to commitment. So you can't bond without trust, and you can't commit to each other without bonding. But, and really the great teams get to that third level where they're totally committed to each other. But like with a Barry Bonds, he never got to bonding, right? He was not bonded with his team. He may kind of think he was bonded to certain people, but he wasn't, bonded to the entire team like everybody else was. But he had the trust and he was committed to the game, even if he wasn't committed to his teammates. And he was committed to his craft. And when somebody's as talented as Barry Bonds, that's enough. You don't need more from a teammate than that. But
Right.
overall, it's, the trust leads to bonding, leads to that commitment. And then when you get there, you really have something.
Yeah, agreed. And I've been fortunate to be on a couple of those teams. And it's interesting because like when I came up with the idea for my book, it was about kind of this high performance culture. And I love the quote that you used from Jake Peavy about everybody elevating the performance of everybody on that team. But it's also interesting because like my perspective on the book was through the lens of like talent acquisition. Like we're going out to get these people and we want it to reflect the culture that we're trying to build. But I know that you've talked about that you can't hire for this type of team chemistry, but yet, kind of our books are both rooted in the element of building this high performance culture.
Yeah.
So just push back on me a little bit, Joan, like where did I go wrong? And like, why can you not recruit for this type of team chemistry or hire for these intangibles?
Well, it's not either or. I mean, you can recruit, and obviously you want to recruit people who share the values that you want to be at the foundation of your culture, right? So you want to hire team players. You want to hire people who are motivated, who are caring, who love being part of a team. They love that. They're not complainers. They're optimists. If you can get all of those, characters in one person, you want to go for that. Now, having said that, yes, those characters can help create the culture. What I found fascinating, and that's so true, what I found fascinating, one of the things that I kind of discovered was that the culture can change the player. So, and I have a chapter about Aubrey Huff, who was this, kind of ne'er-do-well, kind of Yahoo guy who was the, punched the clock. He was the last to come to the park, first to leave, played on terrible teams his whole career, never won anything. So he just kind of, shrugged off and, he had some, weird, perspectives on certain things. So the Giants, God, what year was this? Oh, it was 2010, the Giants' first World Series. And he shows up in the clubhouse. They sign him, like their third or fourth choice. They needed an outfielder who could play first base and had a bat, and he could hit. So he comes in with all this baggage because he trashed the Baltimore Orioles on the radio, while he was still playing for them, and he was carrying that, all kinds of stuff. So he shows up at the spring training thinking, oh, God, this is going to be a slog because everybody knows, nobody wants, whatever. And, he just kind of struts in that the way he does. He struts in like he owns the world. And he goes into the clubhouse, and I happened to be there when he arrived, and I see, and he's introducing himself to all the coaches, but then he goes to his locker room and is kind of bracing for, the cold shoulder. Well, sure enough, who comes over first? I don't remember, somebody like Buster Posey. Hey, great to see you. I'm Buster, okay, and then Tim Lincecum, the big star pitcher, comes over. Hey, hey, glad to see you here, And I interviewed Aubrey Huff later, and he said, I was just so taken aback by this, that they really thought like I was okay. And not only did they think he was okay, these young players looked at him like this, seasoned veteran who could be this wise man for them. And over the course of that season, that's who he became. And it was shocking to everyone who knew him. And he was funny in that he's like what I call clubhouse funny. So like, he walked across, he was the last guy, I think, ever in a Major League Baseball clubhouse who walked around naked. Like, when he arrived, me and the other women, there's always a lot of women in the Bay Area who cover sports. And we're just looking at each other like, what generation did this guy come from? Like the 80s are over, dude. We don't do that anymore. But anyway, he was the leader of that team. And I didn't believe it. And when I was writing the book, in 2014, 2017, all of that, I went back to almost every player on that team and I said, who was the leader on that team? Because I couldn't think. Buster was too young. I couldn't think of who it could be. And they all said Aubrey Huff. And I'm like, there's no way Aubrey Huff was the leader of that team, because he just seemed like such a dolt. But he was. And it was such a lesson in how a really healthy, strong, trusting, committed culture can take an Aubrey Huff and turn him into a leader. Of course, it only happened that one season. And after that, he fell off the wagon. He had drug issues and alcohol issues and wrote a book about it.
Yeah. And like, that's something I think a lot of people miss too, because like, obviously there's a certain weighing of different risk when you're acquiring, especially like with talented athletes, right? A lot of the more talented athletes sometimes will come with more baggage. A lot of that has to do with like how they were raised and like how they've evolved and matured through their sport. But like a lot of people don't understand that like when you go into a certain culture, your situation can impact your success so greatly. Aubrey could have gone to a number of different teams and maybe just been another guy. But because he was going into a locker room with a strong presence, with a strong, maybe like identity of that team chemistry and like understanding that this is the way we do things here, they have really two choices. They either fall in line with everybody else, or they go off and do their own thing, which means that they're going to be by themselves. Which does go back to what you said, which like that doesn't really speak to our human nature. The only reason why people can do that on bad teams is because they know they can get other people to go with them. Man, Coach Burk's messed up. Oh yeah, he is messed up. But on the really great teams, the teams with that great culture, once they start doing that and they're like, no, man, like this is the way we do things here. Like they figure that out really quick, that either I get in line or I'm going to be ostracized here. And it's almost like, regardless of how strongly you feel about what a jerk that coach is or whatever your problem is, it's almost like you bottle that up in an effort to fit in with this great culture and this great chemistry that has been built.
And the other thing about it is that it's really fun to be part of a team that is really committed to each other, right? I mean, there's nothing more fun than belonging and really belonging and knowing everybody in there has your back. I mean, that's what we all miss when we leave sports, right? I mean, we love being part of a team and achieving something, just us, just these people right here have accomplished and are going to accomplish this amazing thing. And that's what happened in 2010, 2012, and 2014 at the Giants. They totally, again, the power of belief, they totally believed they could do this. And people say, well, yeah, okay. But the truth is, in our brains, belief actually has a physiological impact on us. And I remember, I learned this really early on in my life as a softball player. And my dad was my coach, who was, the Irish guy just screaming at us during the entire game. I'm one of 6 kids and I was small and, I was an athlete, but not a great athlete. And my dad would always say to me, and I'm sure he said it to my sisters, I just don't know if they listened, but he would say, when you step on that field, you have to believe you're the best player out there. Just have to believe it. And because my dad told me that, I believed that I should believe this. So when I would go out on the softball field, I would actually hope that every ball was hit to me because I knew I'd catch it. Right. And when I stepped up to the field, I knew I'd hit the ball. Of course, you don't all the time, but you believe that you can. And therefore, you can most of the time. And then when I'm off the field, going to school and stuff, still showed up very small, had no confidence in myself. But for those 2 hours, I could do that. And then when I wrote the book and learned about how belief works, that it's a real thing. It's like, why do placebos work? Because we believe they'll work, and our brain actually responds as, like, if we take a pill that says it's going to take care of your pain, that part of your brain goes into action as if it is attacking the pain, because it is attacking the pain, but it's just a sugar pill. But our brains don't know that.
Right.
So then, it sends it all through the rest of our body, and we're like, okay, we're ready to go.
Yeah. And this is kind of, again, the analytics crowd might look at something like that and say, well, what does that matter? But like you're illustrating, even from your childhood, like you knew that was something that, even though it was an intangible quality, it had a definite impact and influence on the way you viewed yourself, which influenced the way you approached the game, which elevated your performance. And one of the reasons why I included mindset is like one of the 3 areas that I think you want to look for in intangibles, because it's not often seen, and you really do have to really dig deep to find that. And maybe on another level, like you have to dig deep to build that as well. It's not something where you can just show up and everybody has confidence in themselves, so I have confidence. Maybe there's a piece to that, but like there is a deep work that has to be done, and a lot of failure, and like appreciating the successes and continuing to develop that go into those mindsets as well.
It is. And mindsets are contagious too. So your leaders, whether it's your manager or whoever it is, and more important to me, are the clubhouse locker room leaders, because they're the ones that are interacting with the rest of the team, every single day, almost every single minute. So those leaders, those clubhouse leaders, locker room leaders, have huge, huge impact when they have a mindset. The rest of the team looks up to those guys, and it literally is contagious. And to go back to analytics and belief, there are tons of research that does show what oxytocin does in your brain, what placebos do in your brain. Like it's accepted science, it's just science. And that's the thing about analytics, is that we may not be able to measure everything, but we can prove it through science, not necessarily through, numbers and algorithms. And when like a guy like Jeff Kent, who was just a contrarian about everything, what he said, oh, team chemistry doesn't exist, blah, 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 blah. And then you have the conversation where, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. That's, he basically said, if you can't quantify, how do we know? I said, well, do you love your wife? Well, yeah. I said, well, how do you know that you love your wife? How much do you love your wife? Put a number on it. Well, you can't put a number on it. I said, exactly. I said, most of the really important things in our lives are not quantifiable, right? You can't quantify motivation. You can't quantify love. All of those wonderful things that make our lives rich are not quantifiable. And it doesn't mean that they don't exist. Of course they exist. We feel it. And I asked Jeff Kent too, and I said, well, do you think you're a better person because of your wife? Oh my God, yeah. Oh, I'm totally a better person. So she elevated your performance, huh? Yeah, I guess she did.
Yeah, of course. Yes. I like your illustrations. Those are all perfect ways to kind of illustrate the intangibles. Even like a lot of like what you're talking about, I always think that like business equals sports. And really any sports organization is really a mini organization. And I know you talked to me about how a majority of your invitations come from from businesses and corporations. Has it surprised you the eagerness and enthusiasm from the corporate audience with like obviously a book that's rooted in baseball and sports in particular?
It didn't surprise me, but it has certainly pleased me, because while I was writing it, I thought this applies to business. And in fact, my publisher said, well, why don't you do a chapter, about business and connecting the dots? And I thought about it and I said, I don't know business. So I'm not going to write a whole chapter about business. And then they said, well, you're right by Silicon Valley, you can do it. And I said, yeah, but I don't know Silicon Valley. I am going to trust that people in business will connect the dots and will see when they read it that, oh my God, these archetype, these 7 archetype characters, we have them in our workforce. We have it. And so that's exactly what happened. So my speaking gigs and workshops are all businesses. There's not, I've done stuff with the giants, but it's all business. And so that's been super gratifying. And I get to learn a ton about business by making presentations and workshops and doing that research.
Very cool. Very cool. And I can totally agree with everything you just said. When I was writing my book, even though it was largely through the lens of the recruiting process and getting to know players, I was seeing a ton of relation to the business world, right? I think oftentimes, especially in business, it's like specific to talent acquisition and recruiting, we look at a resume, which is kind of the same thing as looking at stats or measurables of a person. Right. And we don't really ask like very tough interview questions. It's kind of like very basic. And like there's not a whole lot of deep digging. And I was thinking the same thing. And as I've written the book and shared it with corporate audiences, like they 100% agree that there's a relation. Because the most common feedback I get after I present on my book, which is about kind of like uncovering these hidden traits and how do you dig deeper, is people always share the story of like, oh, we just hired for this position and this person was wrong specifically because of what you just said. And so it's really interesting how, even though I'm sure for both of us, our focus was purely on the sports aspect, like they're still highly competitive environments. They're still teams. It's still a group of individuals coming together in the pursuit of a goal. And these things that we're talking about, like you can just have a team. You can just get results. But if you want to have those teams that can reach their potential, that can elevate the performance of everybody around them, these are the elements that are needed regardless of sport or business.
That's so true. And if you have a really strong, healthy culture, it perpetuates itself because everybody who's onboarded into that culture is now part of that culture. So they're learning what it is to be in this culture. What does it look like? What are the mindsets? What are the relationships? How am I better? And having the, when you have that trust too, we didn't really talk about this, but you can then be vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable, you can ask for help. And when you're vulnerable, you can ask questions that you think maybe make you look stupid. I built a career on asking stupid questions and allowed myself just to be vulnerable. It's like, how do you do that? Out on the mound there, and I think it's hard, especially for men or any high-powered person. I think it's hard to be vulnerable because people look at you like you know it all. And leadership is so much more impactful when you allow yourself to be vulnerable. And you can't do that unless you feel that you trust and that you feel you are trusted and that your team has your back. It's hugely important.
Yeah. And especially when we're talking about leadership, I mean, I typically work with emerging leaders. So I'm working with people that are in leadership positions, honestly, mostly for the first time or early in their leadership journey. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how many of them think or are worried that they won't have the answer to every single question. And they have this
Exactly.
vision almost that like, I need to be perfect. In the line that I always find myself saying is that like people don't want perfect leaders, they want human leaders. They want
Yes.
real people leading them. They don't expect you to have all the answers. So if you say I don't know, let me find out for you. Like that's perfectly acceptable. And I think speaks to kind of like the vulnerability. And kind of like this vulnerability only happens if you can create that culture for accepting that vulnerability, right? Like we can't just like put this up on the wall and say like, oh yeah, well, you know, we have emotional intelligence here. Like it has to actually be like built by the leader and by the like to create that environment, right?
Totally, totally. And it's interesting that a leader can build trust by being vulnerable. Because if you say, I don't know, you say, oh, I trust this guy. He's not just going to give me some, piece of bullshit, and make it up. I can trust him to come back with the answer. And that's true for employees too, to say, I don't know, because your leader then trusts you more and says, okay, they're not just trying to, they're going to go back, get the information. And I, as the leader, I'm going to get correct information and good information. So he or she is the one I want to give a complex assignment to, because they're not going to just try to make it work. They're going to come back and say, hey, I'm hitting this roadblock. It's a huge, huge thing that builds trust throughout the organization. But it's certainly just as you're moving up in the world, to say, I don't know, it helps you.
Yeah, the authenticity is so key in terms of high performance and specifically to leadership. And just getting people to buy into your vision and bringing those people together. And like, as we're on leadership, and I know we're coming to the end of our time here, you wrote a book with one of the greatest leaders of, I would say, modern sports, Taryn Vandeveer at Stanford Women's Basketball. Yeah. And I just want to hear from you, just kind of, obviously the experience of writing that book with her, but also just kind of like what stood out to her. What stood out to you about her leadership as you guys were putting that book together and maybe in the years since?
Yeah, because that was a long time ago. That was like 1997, 1998. And she had coached the women's Olympic basketball team in the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. And they went, they took a year off. And this is what blew my mind about Tara, is that she had to leave Stanford, and they'd won a few championships, and she left for the year because the USA Olympic Committee and she wanted to make sure this team was totally prepared, because they had lost in the previous 2 years on the world stage and the previous Olympics. And so they went to Siberia, they went everywhere. And she was so tough on them that, and all these women came from WNBA teams, and actually, no, WNBA didn't exist until after that Olympics, but they played overseas, so they played professional ball. So they all had their sponsors, and they kind of, didn't know each other very well. And what did they end up bonding over? Tara, because she was so tough. She was relentless. And that's one of the things I was like, I have never met anyone as relentlessly focused about winning and about getting her players prepared, physically, mentally, strategically prepared. And she didn't care. If they were unhappy, fine, go home. I don't care. But she's brilliant at basketball. But I'd never seen anyone that focused or that hard, so hard on her players. And now she's still at Stanford, and she has softened just in the fact, like, she'll give hugs, she'll laugh, when they just won the last national championship, they dance, she actually got in a line dance with her players, which she would never even think about doing before. So she's evolved. And she did, when I interviewed her for Intangibles, because there's a chapter about that Olympic team, the chemistry on that Olympic team. And she, where was I going with this?
Well, I was just asking about like her leadership and just
Yeah.
you were talking about her changing from the time
Yes.
that you wrote the book originally to like how
Yeah.
she is with her teams now.
Right. And Stanford. Well, as usual, at some point I will lose my train of thought, and there it is. Good. Got it out of the way.
Is that our signal that like we're about done here?
I think I'm about done.
Okay. Information I can
Well, now,
use.
yeah, it just my brain is.
Well, and so I know that you told me this is the last book you're going to write.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah.
do you feel like that you've given your all, or did the book writing has the book writing process just totally torn down any
Oh, yeah.
excitement that you could get for doing that once again?
Oh, it just slayed me. This last book, it's my fifth book. The last three books were really hard, and you're going to find this if you keep writing books, Evan, is
I
that
plan to.
okay? Well, good. I'm going to pass the baton to you then. You write all these books. What happens is that you, and I've just studied and studied and studied writing. Like I just can't get enough of it, and I read and read and read. And so every time I wrote a book, now the next book, I raise my bar, and then I raise my bar, and then I raise my bar. Well, when you raise your bar like this, and you may be over your skis at that point, but you're like, no, this is where I'm going for. And then it took me 10 years, right? Because you're never satisfied. And finally, my publisher, I was past my deadline by a year and a half. And they finally just, ripped it out of my hands. They said, like, you could write this for the rest of your life and you're never going to be finished because there's so much information. So I finally had to hand it over. And I just said, it wasn't fun. It was really, really, really work. The interviews are always fun. Love the interviews. But when it shifts to the writing and the organizing, I just could never get my arms around all that research. I mean, I still probably have a dozen 3-ring binders just filled with information. And I don't even want to look at, maybe 10 years from now, I'll look at them and maybe I don't know. But it's so hard to write a book, especially a book that demanded so much research. So I'm done. And that's why the speaking is great and the Giants work is great. It keeps me thinking and working without having to sit. And here's the irony, that I'm writing a book about how the power of relationships and how other people elevate your performance. And I'm sitting in a drab office at a desk by myself every day. Like, yeah, no wonder I hated it. No wonder I was just like, oh, it took all my energy to just like get going. And so I'd go to coffee shops, just to get a little bit of other energy. But yeah, sorry to rain on your parade, but you've got at least 4 more books to write to catch up.
Well, I like having that North Star to be
Okay.
chasing for the moment. You made a comment that I had heard on another podcast where you had said, I love the research, didn't really care for the writing. And I cannot even describe how much I can, relate to that sentiment. Like I could research all day long, organize all of my thoughts. But yes, it does take a almost Herculean effort to sit down, especially when you are a people person like yourself or myself, to just sit down and like force yourself. Okay, for the next 4 hours, I'm going to try and get some work done. So can definitely identify with that. And maybe I should take a longer timeline on my next book to
I don't think you should get it done fast.
Oh, just go.
I'm not sure how much better it does, but and the one thing about writing is rewriting. And you can rewrite forever. So don't allow yourself to get into that as I do.
Got it. I know for me, this was a topic I loved talking about during my career. I feel very passionately about intangibles, as I know you do. And even I felt myself as I started going through the writing process of I don't really know this. And having to teach myself about what my true thoughts about intangibles were. But I did get to this point the last month I was writing where I was like, okay, today's Friday is the day. And then I got to
Yeah.
Friday and I was like, okay, next Friday.
Yeah.
And I think I do agree with you. You get to a certain point where you're like, I could literally never stop. Like I'm always trying to perfect and try and make it better.
Right.
And at some
Right.
point you just have to like kind of like cut it off and say, okay, this is what it is. And
Exactly.
we could do second edition later.
Exactly.
But Joan
Exactly.
Ryan, thank you so much for spending the time with me today and connecting over Intangibles. I could talk about this forever with you, and really just enjoyable to get a chance to meet you and have this conversation today. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. It's nice to meet another Intangibles geek, and we can just geek out for an hour or so. It totally made my day, Evan. Thanks.